Their arrival and their quest create a crisis for Herod. Herod thinks he's very powerful, but he's also worried. He thinks he needs to take some sort of action to deal with what he perceives as a threat. The story becomes very grim very quickly. Viciousness, court intrigue, the slaughter of innocent children, the Holy Family fleeing into exile in Egypt. The Magi have been following a star. Their conviction is that the star would lead them to a newborn king. And they had come to pay this new king homage. It was a gesture of respect. But either the star was not a reliable guide, or the Magi were not such great star followers, because somehow they ended up in Jerusalem. Now, that's an understandable mistake, since one might reasonably assume that you would find a newborn king in the capital city. Jerusalem was big and impressive. It had an impressive temple and an impressive royal palace. Surely that's where you would expect important things to happen. It's easy to see why the Magi got confused. They arrive and they ask to speak to the person in charge, King Herod. And since they had all the trappings of great wealth, the Magi were readily shown in to see Herod. Barbara Brown Taylor imagines Herod as a king who was old and fat, and he had terrible breath. His skin was yellow, as if his bile had gotten the best of him. And then she says, without even conferring with one another, the wise men knew he was not the one. So they asked him if he knew of any other kings in the area. Herod didn't know what they were talking about, but he found this rumor about a newborn king, well, deeply disturbing. When Herod was frightened, everybody was frightened, all Jerusalem with him. That fear shows the fragility of Herod's hold on power. Just in case there might be something to all of this, he consulted his staff of biblical scholars. And here's the surprise. The biblical scholars got it right. You might think they would see a connection with Isaiah chapter 60, written 500 years earlier, because it seems to fit current circumstances with its reference to visitors on camels bringing gifts of gold and frankincense. It's a perfect epiphany text that speaks of thick darkness covering the earth and all the peoples of the earth, and the glory of the Lord appearing as a radiant light. Those are classic Epiphany themes. In that ancient passage, Isaiah was speaking a word of hope to despondent people who were now returning from exile in Babylon. After years of neglect, Jerusalem was in a shambles. Institutions were not functioning. The economy was a mess. But the prophet reassured them by speaking of the triumphant restoration of Jerusalem, a shining day when the wealth of the nations would come her way. That seems like an appropriate text to shed light on the arrival of these Magi That's why it's in our text for this day. But Herod's biblical scholars came up with a different text. Micah 5, 2 through 4. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days. Now, notice that Matthew has gone out of his way to provide Jesus' lengthy genealogy. This is one whose origin is from of old. If Herod was disturbed by the wise men's quest to pay homage to a new king, the prophecy of Micah further unnerved him. This was not a comforting prophecy of triumphant urban grandeur. It was a prophecy that hints at a peasant revolt. Bethlehem was a little town, an out-of-the-way place, 9 miles down the road from Jerusalem. It was a modest, unpretentious place. The people who lived there were poor. For the powerful and the arrogant, it was a place to stay away from. It was also a place to keep an eye on. Such places could be a source of real trouble. So Herod sent the Magi almost as spies to see what's going on there and then to come back and report to him. The Magi must have been surprised by these developments. After all, they were intellectuals. They had great wealth. They surely didn't expect to find anything of significance in a lowly, unsophisticated place like Bethlehem. But they decided to complete their mission, as strange as that must have seemed to them. They went and found the child. They presented their gifts. Filled with great joy, they paid him homage. And sensing that Herod was up to no good, they went back home by another road. In Matthew's telling, the circumstances of Jesus' birth are very dark and menacing. The story deliberately recalls the Old Testament story of Pharaoh, who decided there were too many Israelites living in Egypt. And if there were to be a war, he worried that they might join forces with the enemy and bring about the demise of his empire. Better to contain them. Still, the Israelites proliferated. There were children everywhere. And so Pharaoh instructed the midwives to kill all the male children. But of course, we know that baby Moses was rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh. In spite of Pharaoh's evil intention, Moses grew up to become the liberator of his people. He led the people out of the Egyptian empire into a new land to build also a new kind of society that was based on trusting God and seeking justice, not on the centralization of power and the threat of violence. Matthew sees Jesus as a new Moses, the liberator of the poor and the oppressed. Later, Jesus will give his teaching to the multitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, recalling Moses coming down from Sinai, Mount Sinai, with the 10 Commandments. Matthew presents Jesus as a new Moses, a new deliverer of the people, a new liberator. Father Donald Sr., former president of Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago, says that this story of the Magi foreshadows a central theme of the Gospel of Matthew. He writes, "In blunt terms, Matthew draws a contrast between the deadly use of power by King Herod and the life-giving power that would be exercised by Jesus, the royal Son of God. In the gospel, Jesus will teach his disciples to love the enemy and to refrain from returning violence for violence. The power of Jesus would be exercised in healing, in confronting injustice, in liberating those gripped by demonic forces. The oppressive power that attempted to destroy Jesus at the very beginning of the gospel story would return and strike at him again in the Passion, in the events of Good Friday. But God's life-giving power would ultimately break the power of death and liberate all those trapped in Sheol. So the power of Herod is a very thin kind of power. It only knows how to do two things when confronted by a threat: either intimidate people or kill them. But Jesus comes to announce that a new kind of kingdom is at hand, a kingdom in which people refuse to believe that the thin power of empire is decisive. These are people who believe that such violent power has already been overthrown by the cross and the resurrection. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann notes that Bethlehem is only 9 miles south of Jerusalem, and he underscores the contrast between Jerusalem with all its pretensions and humble Bethlehem with its modest promises. Like those exiles returning to Jerusalem centuries before, we might be longing for a time when we will triumph over the virus and things will go back to normal and prosperity will return. Then we can relax and be happy once again. But Herod's biblical scholars remember that text from Micah, the text that sends them on to Bethlehem, a place of hope that confounds our most cherished pretensions. Bethlehem is a place of modesty and vulnerability, where a little baby has been born in a barn. Walter Brueggemann says most of us are looking in the wrong place. He says the way beyond is not about security and prosperity, but about vulnerability, neighborliness, generosity, a modest future with spears turned into pruning hooks and swords into plowshares. In an Epiphany sermon, the great Protestant reformer Martin Luther said, "If we Christians would join the Magi, we must close our eyes to all that glitters before the world and look rather to the despised and foolish things. Help the poor, comfort the despised, and aid the neighbor in need." So friends, let us join the Magi and go to Bethlehem in our hearts, so that we might indeed become bearers of good news and pay best homage to the newborn King. Amen, and thanks be to God.